Clothes don't make the man, but I do feel a lot more confident when I'm in a nice suit. And that's how I feel about Elixir Strings. I remember being a kid and hearing Cold Sweat by James Brown on the radio, and something about his confidence paired with the sparseness of the horns going against the drums and the bass groove being so precise and so like there's a great amount of tension on that track where it just feels like it never goes above here. It's just right there. It's so fucking hip, and it's so before its time. And my first time hearing that, I was like, what the hell is this? Because in my household, it was Hendrix, Allman Brothers, Stevie Ray, and in my grandfather's house, it was George Jones, Waylon Jennings, what's the guy? How I Got to Memphis, I forget his name, but that kind of thing. So I was not exposed to that. And then shortly after, Otis Redding, and then Sam Cooke, and then all these just like really, and Robert Plant for that instance, Ozzy Osbourne, Aretha Franklin, Tina Turner, Bob Seger, all these singers who were just like outwardly expressing themselves physically and like emotively and just like really bearing their whole soul on the stage for audience's enjoyment. You could tell that they were feeling something you could tell that they felt relieved after. I wanted that because I had no self-confidence and I had no outlet to get these things off my chest. Certainly didn't have a therapist, or the wherewithal to express myself in that way. So that's where music came in, man.
So, I mean, all those names that you mentioned there, as you say, very, very sort of clear, distinctive musical direction. Not always, they vary the directions they want to go in different styles, but they always have something very specific that they want to say when they take to the stage or they write. That seems like you have the exact same thing, no matter whether it's playing the piano, playing guitar, or singing. You always seem to have something very specific to say. Now, it's the $1 million question, this, but obviously, that's the ultimate thing for a musician, to be able to just express themselves through the instrument. Your journey to get to that stage, what was the real key in finding that you'd actually arrived at that? I'm sure it's still a work in process, but you're very much there, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. It is a process, and I think for me, the amount that we toured and the amount that we, I don't know, just the amount of days we spent on the road and the amount of hours I spent schlepping a guitar through the New York subways and all the way to the back of an airplane, and all the hours I spent, just bargaining with flight attendants to allow me to put my guitar in the overhead bin, and all the hours I spent like playing the guitar, and it's always been there with me, and I felt like I love this instrument so much that I got to put it down for a while. And now I have these rules with myself, like when I'm at home, I don't really play guitar because I love it so much. When I get to the stage, I want it to be fresh, and I want it to feel truly like, I'm so happy to be there. I'm so happy to have that instrument with me and expressing myself fully through it. So when I'm home, I'm either trying to unpack some of the mysteries of musical theory, or trying to just learn more piano, or I like to write on piano because it's just a more expressive medium for me, because I'm not proficient at the piano. It's just a tool for writing for me. So I'm able to really just write what needs to be written. There's no overplaying for sure, because I can't. And there's no gratuitous. I think that answers your question, right?
Yeah, of course. So does that mean then when you hit the stage and you first start playing those few notes, do you occasionally feel a little bit of rust in those first couple of songs, or do you just your hands just always ready?
Oh man, no rust. I mean, I do my due diligence as a performer. Like I love the guitar. I have such an immense amount of respect for that instrument, and I know that it'll try to bite you back if you don't give it the love and the time that it deserves. So I do my warm ups and I do my diligence to maintain the calluses on my fingers, but um, I do a lot of that when I'm like maybe watching a television program
Okay.
or listening to a book. I'll just work on my dexterity. Um, but as far as like being home and being creative, um, and I mean obviously I play the guitar like every day, but just because it's joyous to me and it's just to stay in shape. But as far as like from a creative medium, the piano's kind of been that.
Yeah, you just find it's easier to go in a new direction with it. I mean, you've put so much time. I just had to double check because it's one of these ones you're already a freak of nature when it comes to the amount of talent you've got in that incredible voice. If it's one of these ones that you don't even need to, you don't even need to keep in guitar shape. You just pick it up and you're ready to go. That's just too. That's just too many things, man. That you got going for you. So it's good to know you're still putting in the work. Let's go back to the first time that you played that 62 335, that Gibson 335. When did you first get that in your hands? Because obviously that's been in your family for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like some kids would go to the carnival, or some kids would go to see the circus if it were in town. And for me, a big deal for me, like Sunday afternoon, my grandfather's playing Big Red. He'd let me play that guitar for a moment. I'd have to go wash my hands and get any dirt off of them, and he'd let me play it, under close supervision. Because for us, it was like an asset in the family. Just like he was about that guitar like Ferris Bueller's friend's dad was about his Porsche. It was like that kind of thing. It was like the most valuable family heirloom that we had because we didn't have much at all, really. And he's had that guitar for years, so he took really good care of his stuff. Real military mindset. So first time I played it was probably when I was a youngin', but later when I turned 18, my father gave it to me because I was actually 17, and he gave it to me as kind of a, I don't know, like something to. It's like they're like my ruby red slippers. I was able to always get a little piece of home because I had that guitar, so I never felt fully disconnected from my family.
Incredible. Incredible. And, with an instrument like that, it's obviously full of mojo just because of the personal connection. It's clearly a fantastic sounding instrument. Do you think in general, there's such a big buzz at the moment for vintage instruments and, stores like Norman's Rare Guitars, they've never been busier. Do you think older guitars do have something a little bit more special than something brand new out of the store?
I think the reason they're so sought after is the stories that are in them and the love that's been put into them. It's kind of you know, like my favorite restaurants are like the steakhouses that have been around for hundreds of years, and the padded leather is like there's certain spots where it's been worn in, and you tell that that's somebody's favorite booth, and they come here every week because it's consistent and it's wonderful. And you always get something great. And I feel that way with old guitars. It's like somebody loved them, and that like I love some new guitars have good mojo, and I think that's from like the love of the builder that put it into it. That's why some assembly line guitars just don't really do the thing for me. But like old guitars, they've got stories in them, and some stories maybe that haven't been told, and you're able to get them out. It's a fascinating journey.
Absolutely. And the way you do that, of course, is with, you get tremendous mastery of the instrument. How do you actually visualize the fretboard? Have you got a particular way that works for you?
It's kind of like the way I envision the calendar year. Like the calendar year in my mind is like subsected, uh, like in these blocks. It's weird. It's bizarre to describe outwardly, but like that's kind of how I view the. This is my cat, by the way. Um, it's kind of odd to describe the fretboard. It's like I see it like something I'm dancing on or kind of jumping around. Instead of it being like underneath my fingers, it's like underneath my feet. You know, like the piano in the movie Big. You know, jumping around that way instead of you know, because it's overwhelming to think about it all being under these four fingers.
Sure.
But I think about it like an open highway that I have a little more, I don't know, a little less intimidation, I guess.
Of course, now you're so associated with the blues and soul sort of genre, but there's so much jazz in what you do as well. You're always adding these little outside notes that are just every time it just seems like a perfect choice. Now you've obviously put the work in and you've studied that, but when did you sort of first realise that by adding some of these outside colours, from outside the blues scale, that you were like, actually, that's exactly what I want to say when I'm soloing?
Maybe I had maybe I had a hand in doing this, but all the great, quote unquote blues players I know are all students of jazz, and they're all great jazz players. And I think that's because, like, the blues thing has become so corrupted. It's like, it's kind of where guitar players get thrown if they, you know, don't fit within some other subsect or category. If you're not playing guitar in the top rock and roll band, then you're a blues guitar player, probably. Um, and I've never once referred to myself as a blues guitarist, and that's because I feel like there's real purists still out there, and you know, I would think of myself more as a blues singer than I would a blues guitarist. Truly, I feel like I overplay too much for like true blues standards. Um, and I mean, I'm a student of the blues, but um, I wouldn't consider myself a blues player just because there's so much more in there. So many, like I'm more influenced by other styles of music than I am the blues. So I think that alone kind of knocks me out of the running. Um, but that's why you'll never see me enter my albums in like the best blues category in anything, because it just feels like a farce. I'd feel like an imposter to put out a blues album, unless I did it like truly the right way and like with the families of these blues artists that I, grew up admiring.
Obviously there's a note choice that you have, but something that's so important, whether you're singing, playing guitar, whatever you're doing, is you've got tremendous groove. Now, we talked earlier about the James Brown influence on you, and you don't get any better groove than that. So that's obviously a great starting point. But again, like, what is the key, do you think, to really having great groove and being in the pocket with your playing or singing?
Man, just drummers. I started on drums. I fell in love with the drums. I mean, I say I started on drums just because my family were all guitar players, so guitars were always around the house. So guitar, I always played. It was a given. I can't remember a day that I wasn't playing the guitar. But the first instrument that I had to make an effort and say, like, I want a drum set for Christmas, like, because there weren't any drummers in the family, so I had to like fight, because they were like, no, you don't want to do that. And like, no, that's a bunch of racket. And I had to fight for that, right to play the drums. And I had to ask permission before I could play, because they were watching, their programs. I had a much older family, so they didn't want to hear, an 8-year-old banging around on the drums, that's for sure. But they put up with it. And I was, just as taken by Clyde Stubblefield and Jabbo as I was James Brown. I was just as taken by Lenny Pickett and David Garibaldi as I was, the amazing vocals that were happening in Tower of Power. And I was taken aback by Paul Riddle as much as I was Toy Caldwell and Doug Gray, and obviously blown away by JMO and Butch Trucks. So I just was constantly inspired by drummers and like Al Jackson Jr. guy. I mean, I was always inspired by the rhythm, and then I started putting the dots together. Like, oh man, Clyde Stubblefield, he's on this Public Enemy track because he's the funky drummer. And like then I started connecting, like that's why I fucking love that track. It's because Clyde Stubblefield on it, and because it's also great. So I'm like putting all these dots together, but that's what really sets us all apart is just our rhythmic choices. I would listen to like Method Man on a Wu-Tang track, and I'm like, um, you know, how do I phrase like that? It's like butter. Or like, yesterday I heard a track I hadn't heard in a while, and like the first verse on this song "Twins" with a Z, Big Pun and Fat Joe, which is just a really, it's a song I'm so inspired by because like listen to the first verse, the way that Big Pun delivers what he's saying, and then just think about like how applicable that really is to the fretboard of a guitar, and in that you'll find a whole can of worms, man. It's something I spent a lot of hours unpacking.
So have you found you've actually done that? Take the guitar and you've just actually worked on the rhythms of someone's verse and just try and match the rhythmic pattern, or are you just using it for inspiration and then going back to the guitar?
It's a little bit of both. I'd say predominantly it's kind of through osmosis, and if you're trying to fully just like express oneself without thinking about it first, like true improvisation, then it's really inspiring to listen to like freestyle rappers, like really early Biggie Smalls, for example, and like that whole New York rap scene, like, and then there's even like the collaborative ones that make you think about like how a band works together, like the Beastie Boys or Run DMC, and how they like finish each other's phrases. It's all really inspiring just to hear just inspiration from like osmosis. But in some cases I have sat down and like tried to phrase a verse out the same way.
Do you always hear what you're going to play ahead of time?
No, I try to. That's the toughest thing, man. I overthink everything.
To me, it sounds as if you can always hear what you're going to play just that fraction of a second before.
Hell, in some cases I do. Like, that was an old Miles Davis technique. It's like listen in your brain for the phrase and then execute it. And in some cases, like if I'm just like in a full just like jam session, I'll do that just to fuck around. And for the most part, man, I just try to let it be a vessel. I like to let myself just let it flow through and let it just come out naturally. And, in that way, sometimes it's the wrong note. And Jimmy Herring told me years ago, if you play the wrong note, just do it 3 times.
Now, you've worked with Rick Rubin here on Mood Swings, and of course it's been a tremendous collaboration, not only musically, but it sounds like from, personally as well. Obviously, you've been a big fan of hip-hop. What were some of the things that you were keen to pick Rick's brain on different records he's worked on over the years?
Man, the best example I could think of was us working on song "Fuck My Life Up Again," and we were referencing, or we were looking at like the song and the structure of it, because when I'm writing like that, and I wrote that on a piano, so again, my lack of like chordal knowledge on the piano, so I'm like, it's the same thing all the way through. So we're like, we got to figure out a way to, because we wanted it to be honest and as true as possible, but the song has to have, just like a good story, it's got to have an arc, So we're talking about how to get a pre-chorus for this song, and we didn't want to do it quarterly because we wanted it to keep this like like almost like a hypnotizing groove that just flowed throughout the song. We wanted to keep that. So the way we decided to do it was lyrically, or no, not lyrically, but vocally. And we used Chris Cornell as an example. Chris would jump to the fifth harmony to imply the pre-chorus of the song. So at the end of each verse on Fuck My Life Up Again, there's the fifth, and that was Rick's idea. So that's the main example I could think of where, we reference something, but we would also listen to like services from the Church of Kanye when that was a thing, and just the amazing vocalists that were, in that choir, like, just get inspired by them.
Now, you worked with Dan Auerbach as well on your previous two records, and then Rick on this one. Do you enjoy being produced?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I love being produced because it's just somebody in the room to kind of bring you back down, because I get overwhelmed, and like, especially like I've been in the studio here just recently in the last month or so. I was in the studio like the week that Mood Swings was coming out, and I love it. And I was working with a producer, and he's the one kind of keeping, like, I was in the studio with my band for the first time in a while, and he was the one kind of keeping them like in line. So I didn't have to play the leader, I like being there just as a guitar player, or just as a singer, or just as a bass player in some cases. I just like being there as a musician. I can cut off the part of me that's like running the show, as it were. So I love being produced.
So it sounds like, Marcus, you're already working on new music already, yeah?
Oh yeah.
and is this another hip producer?
He's hip. He's a hip fella.
When will we find out some more info about that? I mean, I know it's all about Mood Swings right now, but you're a fast worker.
Man, I hope to give you some previews of that this winter.
Wow. Okay. Let's quickly talk about the gear on the record, because I'm sure Big Red made a big appearance. But how about the MK Ultra? Were you using that throughout?
MK Ultra was present, I think. Actually, no. I can really quickly tell you what was on this record, because I think we more so tried to rely on just the sound and the approach, and less rely on like Old Faithfuls. Like I always, every record I've ever done, I've had my super reverb. Sorry, that's my dog drinking water. Every record we've had, I've relied on like my super reverb or my Marshall or my MK Ultra. But we were flying around a lot for this album recording process, and we just kind of used what was there. And that was like super reverb reissue. I used the 65 Deluxe at Shangri-La, and I used from Rick's collection, I used his J50 acoustic from the 60s, and I used his 66 ES330 Cherry Red, and I used Big Red, and my 62 Strat, I used that like for the solo on Fuck My Life Up, and I used it on Me or Tennessee, the slide solo, and that was going to be with just a tube screamer. Only other guitar I used aside from the 62 Strat was a lot of the acoustic stuff you hear, like on This Far Gone. That's a good example of the Harmony Sovereign, which is a really spanky model. So 61 Harmony Sovereign, really great, affordable, incredible sound and acoustic. If you want an old guitar but you got pocket change money, like, great for the price. What else? And in the way of pedals, I used tube screamer. And I used a True-Fi, which is a company out of the States here. True-Fi Color Driver, the name of that pedal. And I used, apart from those two, I used like the Neve console is like a pedal itself, just plugging into it and bypassing it and letting it just
Absolutely.
really spin.
What a colour that gives to the record. I mean, it just, it's magic, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you still using Elixirs?
Yeah, Elixir
Yeah.
11s through 50, 49.
When did you get turned on to them?
Um, I was pretty young actually. I mean, I remember I didn't have, you know, in some cases I didn't have enough money to get a Bucky's T-shirt at the gas station because everyone else was getting a Bucky's T-shirt. But we were sharing beds and we were dirt poor. But I was spending money on Elixir Strings. I had two other companies trying to give me free strings, which I never relented because I knew the quality that I wanted, and you know, I was quite young when I started using those, like maybe early teens.
Yeah, because they've got a very specific feel to them, haven't they? So it's one of those ones when you're used to it and it works for you. I mean, they just last for they just last forever, don't they? So it's the perfect combo. Look, Marcus, absolute pleasure to chat with you today. Congratulations on Mood Swings. I know we're going to see you towards the end of the year. You're going to be back in the UK. You got to be stoked to be coming back and playing here. It's been a while, eh?
Been too long, man. We're excited to come back. You guys are always really good to us, so can't wait.
Nice one. We'll see you around Christmas. Okay, have a good summer and enjoy your album release. See you.
Thanks so much. Have a good day.